Okay. We've gotten quite a few people who have joined, so I think maybe it's time for us to get started. Welcome, everybody. My name is Jag Bhalla. I am a member of the DC Science Writers Association, which is the organization that's putting on this event. We've had a very great interest in this topic. We have 300 people who have registered. So I'm going to try and make the most of the time that we have and just jump straight in. So we are very fortunate this evening to have two experts to help us with trying to figure out what global climate justice should mean. That's a very powerful phrase that's used a lot in various discussions, but hasn't been, I think anyway, explained well enough. But our experts are here to help us. I'm going to slightly disrespect these experts, even though I've just said that how important they are by not going through a reading of their extensive accomplishments. I would recommend anybody who doesn't know them to visit the panelists' websites. They are very accomplished people indeed, and it would take me a long time to go through everything that they've done. So what I'm going to do is to just ask each panelist to introduce themselves briefly, perhaps mention their institutional role, and just a brief comment on your focus, the focus of your work on climate justice. So to begin with, can we start with Dr. Sultana?
Sure. Well, hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us, and thank you to Jag for the invitation, and to the DC Science Writers Association for hosting this talk. So I'm Farhana Sultana, and I'm a professor in the Department of Geography and the Environment at the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs at Syracuse University, which is in upstate New York, on the traditional homelands of the Onondaga peoples. I'm also the research director for a program on environmental conflict and collaboration at the Maxwell School, and a visiting faculty fellow at the International Center for Climate Change and Development at the Independent University of Bangladesh. My work primarily focuses on issues around climate justice, water governance, sustainable development, issues of international geopolitics, but then mostly around issues of the intersection between intersectionality and various forms of injustices. So Jag kindly invited us to talk informally for a little bit and then open it up to discussion about what global climate justice can mean. So what I want to do is just talk about, well, how do we think about global climate justice and then apply that analysis to various scales and regions? And I do not have slides. I started to prepare one, but then I thought people might get bored of looking at pictures they might have seen in the past about global warming, about the various kinds of disasters that are happening, and the ways that pollution is expanding. So I don't want to start off with that immediately. But I wanted to also raise that there are global concerns, and they're rising exponentially in terms of climate breakdown, and there's greater incidences of climate-related disasters, whether it's floods or hurricanes or wildfires and storms. And that has catapulted more and more people over years to demand climate justice. And that obviously means different things to different people, but it has become a rallying cry, like an umbrella term. And the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, reports that have been coming out for over 30 years have been raising alarm bells of accelerating climate change, creating tipping points for some time. And as a result, we're finally seeing more younger generation of people paying attention to these escalating, devastating impacts. So in general terms, what do we mean when we talk about climate justice? So for me, it means thinking about climate change, which is perhaps some people think of it as a scientific physical phenomenon, but climate justice makes it a justice and ethics issue. So it is not just about science and not just about techno-managerial solutions, but it actually moves the conversations and debates away from the hegemonic or dominant climate science conversations of modeling and charts and graphs, which are important, but to look at, well, how did we get here? And what are the social impacts? And what are the outcomes of these shifts that we're seeing? So it is known that climate change is a threat multiplier in terms of how it can start to destabilize other ecological and biospheric functions. And it is not just about working to address what that means, like, how do we get here, not debating the science, that is fairly well known, but then in terms of bringing attention to how those things or change or devastations or breakdowns or accelerating phenomenon affect different people differently and unevenly and disproportionately. And then the resultant injustices that appear from that, and then to think about how do we redress this crisis that's slowly evolving and kind of in a cataclysmic way, one's leading to the next. And once you're made vulnerable, it's harder to recover from that, to be resilient or to be able to bounce back from the next crisis or shock. So what happens is, in order to address or redress in fair and equitable ways, we need to think about the marginalizations and the exploitations and oppressions that keep arising or that undergird why climate change occurs the way it does. This means climate change is a political issue, and applying a climate justice approach is an intentional process. It means clarifying and investigating how both climate change itself and any actions taken to redress it, whether it's mitigation or adaptation, can result in varied outcomes. We need to pay attention to who benefits, who loses out, in what ways, where, and why. And climate justice results in becoming an explanatory tool. So it's an explanatory tool that helps us make better sense of the relationships at different scales that co-create and maintain the various injustices, which then climate change basically amplifies. So we know that there's uneven, unequal burdens. You and I on this Zoom call are not experiencing climate change in the same way, because the planetary crisis is one of what is known as the common but differentiated responsibility. This was identified at the UNFCCC, which is the United States Framework Convention on Climate Change, in 1992 at the Rio Earth Summit. It implies that some countries produce significantly more climate pollution than others, and therefore have a greater responsibility to fix the problem. It's kind of like you broke it, you buy it. But it also means that we're highlighting the fact that there are communities who have contributed the least, but then who are facing more impacts of these breakdowns. And they're unduly burdened and harmed, and they've been harmed for decades. So when we think about fixing climate change being everyone's problem, there's a disproportionality in impacts and also in responsibility in terms of who colonized the atmosphere, that is, released more greenhouse gas emissions and took up more of their fair share of the global atmospheric climate or carbon budget. As a result, the historical and geographical differences are brought to the forefront in discussing climate justice instead of just climate science. So we need to address those issues that no one wants to talk about, like exploitation and extraction and domination and imperialism, but they do come into sharper focus, and they have done at least since 1992. So what I and other scholars call this climate coloniality or climate colonialism, and that means when variously racialized, marginalized populations, often in countries that were once colonized by European colonizers or those who are continuing to face US imperialism, end up encountering those disproportionate impacts of climate change and ecological devastations, and are thereby rendered more vulnerable. Their abilities to cope with and respond to and adapt to climate impacts are curtailed, both from historical reasons, but also current or contemporary factors that are geopolitical, but then also socioeconomic. So when we think about the uneven and unequal vulnerabilities and marginalizations of deaths and devastations that are continually taken for granted, we have to draw attention to the continuities from the past and into the future. And it is a form of slow violence against the planet's poorest and most vulnerable. And this ongoing climate coloniality is expressed in various forms, such as insidious racism on a global scale. So the tapestry is expanded, and this continuing othering, creating these disparate exposures to harms from more powerful climate-induced hazards, and then those overlapping tipping points. But it is also experienced through the continued ecological degradations that are both overt and covert, so episodic and creeping. So where we see that global capitalism ends up articulating with developmental desires and economic growth ideologies to produce even more harms that compound the colonial legacies. And this is occurring in entire countries and communities across the global south, and increasingly in communities of color in the global north. And ultimately, it will affect everyone, barring perhaps the very wealthy, who might perhaps save us all and colonize Mars and leave us alone. So climate coloniality, when we think about it here on Earth and not on Mars, is from, you might be wondering, well, what does it look like? Well, it's about global land grabs and water grabs, deforestation for growth or neoliberal conservation projects. It's fossil fuel warfare. It's those green revolutions for agriculture that end up reducing or wasting biodiversity. It is about rare earth mineral mining and carbon offsetting programs for the wealthy who end up dispossessing and historically impoverishing others in more poorer countries. And these interventions come in various names. Some call them green colonialism, carbon colonialism, fossil capitalism, but they often have similar outcomes in terms of that domination and displacement and degradation and impoverishment. And this form of extractivism, that ideology of endless economic growth on a finite planet, is continually propagated. It's upheld, it's celebrated in the media, by global capital, by state-sanctioned interventions. And that perpetuates and compounds those climate impacts, both within and beyond boundaries of any country. And yet, after decades of evidence of escalating climate harms, there's actually been very little mitigation in reducing greenhouse gas emissions across the whole world. So what global climate justice means is elevating those equity considerations and who should reduce more, who should demand more equity in terms of removing the harms, redressing the inequities and inequalities that ultimately kill. And it means that the underlying commitments to global climate justice is one of political action and collective solidarity. And the critical approaches to climate justice have to continue to look at issues around exposure, vulnerability, responsibility, and ethics. So if we think about global climate justice as one of accountability across and between nation states, between capital and community, we can think about issues around human rights and obligations, because these are all part of justice. And so when we think about the global political economic systems that produce and reinforce these harms and injustices, we need to address them where we meet them and find them, but then also challenge the systems and structures that keep them at play, because we do not want to continually impact or burden impacted communities, because it's going to all come back and bite all of us, even if we're not feeling it right now. So what that means is we have to look at uncomfortable issues such as the role of power, of structural inequities, about social disparities, and how these are embedded in multi-scalar issues across wider geopolitics, development interventions, but then also things we call progress. So we need more critical attention to addressing these inequalities and marginalizations and vulnerabilities that are both being created and reconfigured through these disruptive climate patterns and related impacts, as well as the solutions pursued to fix the problems. So for instance, electric vehicles need lithium batteries. Where is the lithium being mined? Or for your iPhone, where is the coltan being mined? It's being mined by children in the Congo. So we're maintaining various forms of dispossession through these forms of material and energy related consumption patterns. So finally, I want to just end on the note that when we think about climate justice, we need to apply understandings of wider intersectionality in terms of different harms that play out across groups, because no community, and especially vulnerable communities, are not homogeneous. They're intersectionally differentiated by gender, class, race, disability, and so on. And this means that we need on-the-ground analysis and data. And we need to work with social justice movements on the ground to look at the contextual axes of oppression and differentiation. For instance, Climate-fueled water scarcity means more women and girls in very poor countries are spending more time and labor fetching drinking water around the world. That is a climate outcome, and it is a gendered one, and it's a racialized one. So when we start to look at these issues, we can make these connections and seek out equitable solutions and figure out whether it's local, global, or both. It's usually both. And we can elevate a range of voices from marginalized communities because they're hardly ever heard or heeded in the corridors of power. And if we think about organizations and institutions that are increasingly talking up climate justice, we need to look at where are their funding priorities? What interventions are they doing? Who are they collaborating with? What are the ways that state and non-state actors are enabling equitable climate justice within and beyond borders, and recognize that, there's a normative aspect to climate justice, which makes international negotiations very difficult, because the global north often doesn't want to take responsibility for historical and contemporary high emissions. And this is a major sticking point. So this brings me finally to climate finance, and which has been very slow for a long, long time. But, demands have been met. Well, okay, fine. If you're not going to figure out how to help these communities adapt or invest more in mitigation measures or finance loss and damage, which is, irreparable or irrecoverable losses from climate impacts and ecological breakdowns, well, then what can we do? Can we think about debt cancellation as part of, climate reparations? Or can we fill the fund of the loss and damage fund? Can we reduce these forms of capitalist extractivism that is continually fueled by hyperconsumption? So there are many, many components that we can explore that any of us can look into. How do we reduce fossil fuel dependency? How do we have more just transition? How do we, support proper justice-oriented decarbonization, not just mythical technologies? And then how do we think about making those reparations for colonial legacies of harm, because they're ongoing, they're not static. And this means that we need to therefore reaffirm a commitment to the solidarity work that we need to do with communities to redress root causes, but at the same time, think about, well, what does advocacy mean? What can we do to think about helping each other learn more and do better? How do we restructure relationships to each other, to ecologies, to lands, to waters, that we're intimately, materially, and geopolitically connected to? And so what we are witnessing is that there is more demand for global justice, and there is more mobilization and action around it. And I think this is really important, where we can find ways to leverage our relational privileges to work, across groups of policymakers and politicians and journalists and students and citizens and academics to challenge these escalating breakdowns, and then to also think about what does it mean to actually cooperate and listen and recognize that political action can be revolutionary when it fosters that collective well-being that is simultaneously social, political, and ecological. And I'm going to end it there so I don't go over my allotted 15 minutes. But thank you for listening. And if you'd like to learn more about my research or publications, you can just visit my website, which is my name, farhanasultana.com. And you can access all my publications where I elaborate further what I mean by critical climate justice or climate coloniality, or what do I mean by climate revolutions that are full of care or part of care ethics. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sultana. It's a very rich introduction to the issue. I just want to emphasize that Dr. Sultana did mention that this language about commitment to climate justice has been in the official documents since 1992. The phrase that was used that Farhana mentioned is common but differentiated responsibility. And there's been a commitment to that in a vague sense, but you can probably hear in some of what Farhana has been mentioning that there's been very little follow through in concrete terms as to what that actually means. But now I'd like to ask Dr. Táíwò to introduce himself and to give us his overview of his thinking on the issue. Thank you.
Thanks a lot to everybody for being here. Thanks a lot, Jag and Sam, for putting this together. Dr. Sultana for being here with me and giving a great kind of introduction to this conversation. And a lot of what I have to say, I think, will follow pretty nicely from a lot of what Dr. Sultana had to say, maybe in particular the point about tracking power across different scales. I think that's a area of focus for me. And so I want to kind of try to add something particular as a focus of climate justice. I'm not pretending that this is exhaustive, like this is the only set of things that we would need to think about. But I sat down and I thought, what's the one thing I could say to a group of science writers that is maybe different from the existing focus of topics that I often see in writing on climate justice and climate change and climate politics in general. And so I'm just going to shill for redistribution as the climate solution. If you take one thing away, it's I redistribute now. So what's there to be said for this perspective? In the lead up to this, in the few minutes when we were in the virtual green room, Jag and Farhana and I were talking about Katrina, and that's Hurricane Katrina being a disaster that everyone remembers. And people, of course, remember the hurricane, and people remember the sort of immediate aftermath of the hurricane, the kind of botched aid response, the racist description of people who were trying to survive without aid. And those are absolutely things that we should remember about this disaster. And to add to that, I think we can also take a look at the long-term kind of destruction of infrastructure and critical aspects of the built and natural environment in New Orleans, the built literal ecological environment, the built political environment. So starting with a bit of both, on the left, you see some uprooted trees, and on the right, a quotation from a City Lab article that came out in spring of last year, where they were tracking the fact that the majority of neighborhoods in New Orleans lost hundreds of thousands of trees to damage to various storms. And now 2/3 of them have less than 10% canopy cover, with housing projects well under 2%. And these patterns track race and class in more or less the ways that you would expect. So Blacker neighborhoods, poorer neighborhoods, working class neighborhoods have fewer trees and worse health. So the worst urban heat island effect in the United States is in this part of the country, with some neighborhoods experiencing heat waves that are 18 degrees hotter than other parts of the city, wealthier parts of the city, which is, of course, very directly a differential vulnerability of exposure to potential death and harm health-wise. And I'm going to sit this thought down next to another one that was observed by a local Black newspaper, the New Orleans Tribune. And they were taking stock of the political infrastructure that has shifted in the years following Katrina. In one sense, Katrina presented an opportunity. Destruction could have been a catalyst for rebuilding that would have rebuilt along lines of justice and egalitarian access to opportunity. What happened instead, at least according to the New Orleans Tribune, is essentially widespread capture of the public education system and of the possibility of public education by people whose agenda was, in general, to take charge of and exploit the vulnerable public institutions that happened in New Orleans. And thinkers like Naomi Klein have a long history of engaging with the general sort of political opportunism that followed the Hurricane Katrina. We have seen similar sorts of episodes in response to the disaster in Puerto Rico. And I'm trying to suggest to you all today that this is the climate crisis. Or at the very least, we would gain something by starting to think about the climate crisis along these terms. Much of the writing that I see, much of the conversation that I see about climate politics emphasizes these large-scale kind of ecological and economic categories. What's the rate at which solar is being integrated into the grid? What is the rate at which wind turbines are going up in various parts of the country? What is the parts per million of CO2 this year? How are emissions trending? Are they trending up or down? When will they peak? And these sorts of questions are important. But the thing I think is worth adding to this perspective is the more straightforward political distributive ones. We need to change our actual ecology. It is of grave consequence what the level of CO2 concentration and greenhouse gas equivalent concentration is. But it is also of grave relevance and maybe even of root relevance what the balance of power is between the various segments of society and how climate crisis threatens to exacerbate existing inequalities in a fairly direct sense. So that is broadly the perspective. I'm going to just try out a different oversimplification and see if we can put a different kind of gloss on exactly the analysis Dr. Sultana was just explaining from this kind of distributive way of thinking about things. You ask me to describe how capitalism works. I would say it is an economic system where the harms, the poisons, the death is socialized, and the wealth is privatized, right? You can agree with that, you cannot agree with that. But if we were to describe the course of climate politics, I think that description would get you some mileage. I think that right now, shareholders who hold stock in Exxon, including these big asset managers who simply manage the funds of institutional investors, I think they are betting that it will be more worth it to the few people that have portfolios under their management to achieve a higher rate of return for a few years than to keep the planet habitable for everyone's children. And that's the climate crisis, right? It's not these CO2 numbers, it's not these degrees centigrade. It is that political problem. And maybe, I think you would be fair to say this guy's a political philosopher. He's only got the hammer, and so everything's nailed to him, and you would be right about that. But let's just see what it gets us. So suppose you were to take an empirical look at what decides climate change vulnerability. Adger, Brooks, and Kelly a few years ago did exactly this. They ran a bunch of regressions, and they found that they could compute a climate change vulnerability index, which would essentially rank countries in terms of the extent to which their populations are vulnerable to the harms of climate change. And they computed this index by figuring out which sorts of indicators seem to contribute to climate change impacts that we're seeing in the present. And they found 11 indicators that seem to do a good job of predicting what kind of problems you have in response to ecological calamities. Those indicators include, but are not limited to, general life expectancy, maternal mortality ratio, dietary adequacy, the percentage of population with access to sanitation, measures which more or less say to what extent the actual infrastructure of society does the job of socializing wealth and benefits. The better a country is at that, the better a society is at giving people access to healthcare, to reliable food in general, to information. We could see literacy rates as something of a proxy for that. The better the society tends to do at protecting its citizens in general, which applies to climate impacts. And on the left, you see the result of some work that some colleagues and I did using this index that they put together. And just as Dr. Sultana was just explaining to us, we find a fairly straightforward relationship between colonial history and those indicators. By and large, the countries that are best able to protect the lives, the maternal health, the dietary adequacy of their populations with the biggest depth and breadth are the countries that won out from yesterday's injustices that built the streams of capital that explain who has wealth and where wealth accumulates. We don't need a planetary perspective to see the utility of this kind of politics first approach. Even internationally, so I'm using the United States because that's where I live and I have access to some information about it. There are a number of studies starting from the 1980s and continuing well into the present day that link various kind of ecological harms, in this case, toxic waste pollution, so kind of local pollution, locally unwanted land uses, and particularly illegal ones, to the demographic composition of the people being polluted. It's not because, for example, there's some inherent connection between being Latino or being Black American and toxic waste, but it's because the communities that disproportionately have those demographics in them are the kinds of communities that are unable to protect themselves from various sorts of economic and environmental predation. So you have the phenomenon of green crime havens, which tracks race and class inequities, again, in much the ways that we would expect. So skipping a bit, the thought being expressed here is just a more complicated version of the thought that we started with. What is the problem of pollution? At least from a distributive perspective, it seems to have some pretty clear ties to political history, whether we're looking at the nation state level or we're looking internationally, which communities get various levels of pollution. And the thing that I am proposing, the grander conclusion that I'm proposing, is that this is just how our system works. This is the system that was built. It was built to create both wealth and to create toxins and waste. And it was built not only to produce those things, but to distribute those things. So the nature of the economy that we've developed on the back of fossil fuels and on the back of a quite extensive colonial history around and beyond those fossil fuels just is such that it funnels value to the north and toxins to the south, and value up the racial and class hierarchies and toxins down and across them. So it's not just an unhappy coincidence that climate change and climate impacts disproportionately affect marginalized community, but it is part and parcel of how the economic system works in general. It's in keeping with its basic characteristics. So if we were to take it that those distribution systems built into how the global economy works and how national economies work within it have some kind of primary role, some kind of root explanatory role in the nature of the climate crisis, then perhaps I would be able to convince you that changing those flows likewise had a root role if we are thinking about solutions. What should we do if the way that we produce and distribute wealth and toxins creates climate crisis? We should distribute differently. Among the things we should distribute differently are certainly wealth and dollars. But if we're recalling the climate change vulnerability index, we also might want to redistribute hospitals, food access and sovereignty, sanitation. Those things certainly have to do with wealth, but they are not reducible to wealth. You're going to have to create hospitals and sanitation facilities and redo how the food system works, all these sorts of broader kind of constructive goals. If we were thinking about redistributing wealth more broadly, we could identify a number of different opportunities that there are to redistribute wealth. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go through all of these, but I will just mention of the ones on the screen. Dr. Sultana mentioned debt cancellation. That's something that a number of social movements have been calling for, and that I think would greatly expand the decision-making capacity of countries on the receiving end of debt cancellation, which would presumably include climate-burdened global South countries. And that could, if political conditions are right, turn into greater social spending and greater climate change security for the populations of people that live in those places. You could imagine something like that making a major difference. But I don't want to leave you just talking in terms of dollars and cents, but I think redistributing decision-making power, political power in a direct way is also something that many scholars and activists have been talking about under the heading of climate justice and quote unquote real climate solutions, and it's something that deserves a lot more serious attention and deserves to be more of a core aspect of how climate politics is talked about. So long as the people who get to sit at the bargaining table at COP are calling the shots, we can expect suboptimal results. So long as the Exxon Mobils of the world and even the Saudi Aramcos of the world are calling the shots, we can expect suboptimal results. So what if we reorganize? What if we shifted how decision-making works in various ways? Again, there's more on this screen than I can reasonably do justice to in the amount of time, but I will just mention participatory budgeting in particular is something that researchers like Cabanes have been linking to climate solutions fairly generally. Participatory budgeting is a sort of community level town hall format where people get together and decide in a fairly direct democratic fashion what spending priorities are for their city or municipality. There have been a number of cities that have used this kind of approach, which was pioneered by the Brazilian Workers' Party in the late 1980s, in the 21st century to tackle various climate adaptation and climate mitigation goals. And I think it's something, again, that deserves a more serious look and more serious attention by various aspects of society as something that could be part of a larger kind of transformative vision. So in closing, just to respect everyone's time, there's a lot wrong with the excessive focus on carbon and temperature. There would be a lot wrong with excessive, focus on even the things I've talked about in the last 15 minutes. But I think trying out the oversimplification in the direction of putting the politics first might be a useful kind of response to the received wisdom on climate politics. If we thought of our global distribution system, the distinctions between the haves and the have-nots in terms of wealth and political power as the defining feature of the climate crisis, rather than simply an addendum of the climate crisis, I think we might get a bit further on moving the needle on our broken climate politics. So we do need to change our actual ecology, but I don't see us doing that without changing the basic political parameters that condition how we respond to that ecology. Thank you.
Thanks, Femi. That's an excellent addition to the discussion. What Farhana emphasized is that this is a moral and an ethical issue, and we should think about it in that way to start with. One of the things you've brought up is that where that naturally leads, Femi, is redistribution, substantial global redistribution. Some of the figures you showed were very clear that ex-colonized nations are at the bottom of the resource pile. And I'm going to actually use moderator privilege to insert a slide that I have that can show us what the IPCC's modeling scenarios are currently projecting for the future. This is despite the fact that the IPCC documents have had excuse me a moment. I am not very good with technology here. The IPCC documents from the very beginning have had this requirement for justice and equity in them, and despite that, the models that they produce are of this nature. And we'll get to the one slide now. No, we won't. I'm still not doing what I need to do. Oh dear, forgive me. Okay, here we go. Can you see that's yeah, got it. Okay, so the sorry, slideshow. Right, so this is a chart produced by a research group in India led by Kanitka et al. And what you see here is per capita consumption of goods and services in IPCC scenarios projected out to 2050. On the left of these lines is where we are now. On the right is where these things end up in 2050. As you can see, sub-Saharan Africa goes from, forget the units here, but from 1 to 3, whereas North America goes from 35 to 59. And the conclusion that these researchers come to is that all IPCC scenarios on average project a highly unequal future that perpetuates most existing inequalities. You'll note from these lines that none of the lines in blue are even catching up to any of the rich nation red lines where they are now, never mind where they're going to be in 2050. There's no catch-up of resources at all. And in fact, the per capita consumption in sub-Saharan Africa is modeled at 1/20th of the US level in 2050. And in between, 14 times more resources per capita are used to enhance the lifestyles of rich nations than are allocated to alleviating poverty in sub-Saharan Africa. So this is what is actually built into the IPCC scenario modeling processes at the moment. Kanitka et al. Conclude that not only are there no reallocation of resources, in fact, there's a disproportionate burden of mitigation placed on developing nations in these scenarios. Other research, this is by Jason Hickel et al. This is the energy per capita out to 2100. All we need to focus on here is that there's no convergence. And the only conclusion that we can draw from that is there's an enormous disconnect between the lovely rhetoric about justice and all the work that's being done at a detail level by IPCC models. My way of concluding there is that this doesn't look like a good faith effort at climate justice based on the actual resources that are being planned. I will abuse my moderator privilege for one more tiny slide. I'm trying to promote the idea of lifetime resource expectancy. So we're used to comparing life expectancies. Femi did that with some of the data that he showed, but if you do a very rough estimate of the resources that are dedicated to the flourishing of lives in different parts of the world, you can get a rough estimate for this by multiplying life expectancy with GDP per capita. And relatively few people are going to be mindful of the fact that life expectancy in Nigeria right now is 23 years shorter than in the US. And you really get the magnitude of the disparities here when you do the lifetime resource expectancy calculation, because the average Nigerian has 1.9% of the resources allocated to their flourishing that the average American does, and 3% for the average Bangladeshi. These comparisons at the averages are not actually all that representative, because what we really should be doing is comparing top to bottom. And when you take that view, the average member of the global top 1% earns more in 12 days than the average member of the bottom 10% does in their entire lifetime. There's a generalized view that we're making good progress on global poverty that's been promoted by various optimists like Steven Pinker, but it just doesn't square with the facts. The current UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty, Olivier de Schutter, has estimated that under current distribution arrangements, basically allowing markets to allocate, capitalist markets to allocate resources, it will take over 200 years to end poverty at the $5 per day level. So let me drill this point home. That's 8 generations to get the global poor to 1/8 of our poverty level. The US federal poverty level is $40 a day. And in every single year of those 8 generations, approximately 340 times more resources are allocated to gains in the living standards of the global top 10% than to the bottom 10%. Again, this is in no way coherent with the idea that we're trying to move towards a more just world. Anyway, that's enough for my moderator privilege. Let's get back to the discussions. So I feel like a lot of these, the magnitude of the task in front of us isn't widely known. The intent to want to do better is captured in this rhetoric, but it doesn't materialize in any concrete way in either exercises like modeling or in actual allocation of resources. So we are actually don't have a great deal of time left. I'm wondering if anybody wants to, they could stay a little bit longer, but to try and respect the time that people have, I'm going to have a quick switch to questions that were presented by the audience. And the first question came from Rose, and she asked, what panelists talk about their theory of change? What frameworks can we, researchers, political activists, etc., use to guide our programs of action? Please, whoever wants to take that. Theory of change. How do we get these changes enacted?
So I can just say something quickly. Yeah, I think that's a very important question. I would basically describe my theory of change as a kind of contest theory, right? So I would contrast with that with a sort of messaging or general will theory of political change, where if you get more people on board with the idea of climate justice, or maybe with the right idea of climate justice, and there's a kind of cascading effect on the political process that results in better policy or better transformation of some kind. I don't have that sort of theory. I think that's part of why I am so hard on so starkly in favor of team redistribution, because I think there are various teams of politics, and the tenor of politics is set by which team is winning and to what extent they are winning. Right. So right now, fossil capital is winning in terms of setting the agenda for fossil fuel phase out, or more accurately, the lack thereof. And until they meet organized resistance by a sector of society that has not only objectively different goals that are incompatible with theirs, but also is self-consciously organized around those, I don't think we will see better politics. So I think what that probably looks like is an ecology of organized movements. I think workers' unions are a classic example of, organized people, particularly working class people. But I think there are two kinds of social movements that I think would pair well with that, in an ecology that is likelier to put together a kind of winning coalition. One would be some kind of organization among ratepayers, so people paying for energy, whether it's transit riders unions, ratepayers unions, whether it's organized people who have successfully put one energy democracy, so put energy production in a subnational entity or even a national entity under meaningful public control. And I would sort of sit that next to the food system. So there's really exciting work being done, for example, by peasant militants in various parts of the world. MST in Brazil is a great example of workers, landless workers movement, as they call themselves, but people who, by paying attention to the land and the food system and building political power around that, have managed to exert lasting power over the political process in general. And I think the more developed those movements are individually, the likelier they are to be able to wield a force that could displace fossil capital in terms of having its arm around the throat of climate politics. But it's a conflictual view of change.
Farhana, do you have anything to add?
Sure. So there are a lot of similarities with what Dr. Táíwò just said in terms of thinking about not just redistribution, but also the bringing together of movements. Because, climate justice is essentially, at the end of the day, about praxis, which is theory, practice, reflection. So you do better by learning more, doing better, thinking about it, collaborating. So I think taking from that, or learning from those histories of kind of anti-colonial movements or feminist resistance movements or decolonization movements from indigenous communities, such as Land Back, or in terms of protecting forestry, whether it's like the Chipko movement in the Himalayan foothills, to, Standing Rock and against pipelines, or what was mentioned, the MST, the landless workers movement, or La Via Campesina, which is the farmers or peasant movement. So, there's all kinds of ways that these kind of come together, but they have similar types of a central kind of cosmology, which is about valuing and ensuring futures of people of color. So valuing Black, Indigenous, and people of color, BIPOC futures, because historically for 500 years, this racial capitalism and this coloniality has centered and front and centered kept white futures as a guarantee, as a North Star, right? Like, how do we ensure this? But then at the same time, then fine, we'll think about the colonies or the ex-colonies, the newly independent nation states in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. So we need to think about how in settler colonial contexts, or in occupied territories, or in post-colonial contexts, how do different communities come together to challenge those kinds of dominant hegemonic geopolitical ideologies of extraction and disposal, like both communities, like entire sacrifice zones? So I think that kind of increasing social movements, but for me as an educator, it's also about unlearning to relearn. And that comes a lot from like Latin American decolonial scholarship, but then also various forms of African anti-colonial cosmologies in terms of what are the received wisdoms that you have to unlearn so you can relearn different ways of being in the world and relating to each other. So I think perhaps, yeah, I would like to see people be willing to unlearn and challenge the system and, you know, push back against those received wisdoms. And I think with journalism and with writers, it's really important to keep pushing that away because people read what you write. In terms of slowly educating the public that you need to understand other things. It's not just about what influencers and pop culture teaches you, right? It is about learning laterally and learning differently. So for me, it is all about that re-education so that we can think about you know, what are called pluriversal futures, which is how do we value different ways of being instead of this kind of universalized, you know, very, very kind of, it's called, you know, necropolitical. It means that it thrives through death and profit and survival or beneficence to a smaller minority at the top. You know, how do we challenge that to think about different ways of what does well-being mean? So, you know, we don't have to think about well-being through GDP and through mass consumption and mass production and waste, right? In this linear economy, we need to have a theory of change that's more recursive, that's more circular, that's more feminist, that's more indigenous, that's more centering of these, you know, people who are vulnerable and marginalized. And that should be front and center rather than aspirationally wanting to be more extractive, more part of that necropolitics. So that's my theory of change.
Thanks, Farhana. I'm afraid we are coming right up against our deadline here for the hour. It's a wonderful conversation. We've only scratched the surface. Maybe we should organize another event. But I'd just like to thank both Dr. Táíwò and Dr. Sultana for their comments. I'll thank the questioners and the attendees and ask that if anybody is interested, our next event will feature Dr. Francis Collins. Please check our website for further details. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.